The cold afternoon air in Whispering Pines Valley carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a familiar comfort to the man who called it home. But this afternoon, something was wrong. Max, his German shepherd, a creature of silent companionship and unwavering discipline, suddenly broke the quiet. It wasn't a bark of excitement or a warning of a stray squirrel. It was a low, persistent growl, a sound that vibrated with an urgency Jake had not heard in years. The dog's body was tense, its gaze fixed on a small clearing by the creek. Jake followed, his hand instinctively resting on the hunting knife at his belt. There, half hidden by ferns, lay a young doe. Her breathing was shallow, her beautiful brown eyes wide with terror and pain. It wasn't a hunter's wound or the mark of a predator. A strange, chemical burn marred her flank, a patch of hide seared away, leaving an ugly, discolored wound that seemed to poison the very air around it. Max whined softly, nudging the deer's head with his nose, a gesture of profound empathy that cut through Jake's hardened exterior. This was more than an accident. It was an atrocity, a violation of the wild sanctuary he had come to protect. He knew this moment was the beginning of something, a dark current pulling him from his quiet solitude into a confrontation he had tried desperately to avoid. The chemical scent rising from the wound reminded him of battlefields he'd left behind, of corruption and betrayal that had driven him to this remote valley in the first place. Jake knelt beside the injured doe, his past training surging to the forefront as he assessed her condition with the methodical precision of a combat medic. The careful, practiced way he moved was a testament to a life he had tried to leave behind, a life of calculated risks and unspoken duties that had scarred him more deeply than any physical wound. He had chosen this valley, this self-imposed exile, to silence the echoes of that former existence, particularly the memory of betrayal that had shattered his trust in authority and left him questioning everything he had once believed. The chemical burn on the deer's flank was unlike anything natural, its edges sharp and deliberate, suggesting industrial waste rather than accidental exposure. Max stood watch, his intelligent eyes scanning the surrounding forest for threats, while Jake worked. The bond between them ran deeper than owner and pet. They were partners forged in the crucible of loneliness, each providing the other with a reason to keep fighting when the world had turned its back on them. After gently lifting the doe, Jake carried her back toward his cabin, a grim purpose hardening his features. As he cleared the tree line, his blood ran cold. There, gleaming like a slap in the face, was a new sign hammered into a post at the edge of his property. It was a glossy, ostentatious advertisement for a new luxury resort, promising exclusive tranquility and pristine wilderness experiences. At the bottom, in bold, arrogant letters, was the name of the developer, Elias Vance. The name hit Jake like a physical blow, a ghost from his past now haunting his sanctuary. Elias Vance, the corrupt officer whose crimes he had exposed, the man whose disgrace had been the catalyst for Jake's own departure from a military he no longer recognized. Vance wasn't here by chance. This was personal. The wounded deer was no longer just a victim of environmental crime. It was a declaration of war from an old enemy who had found him at last. The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the jagged peaks surrounding Whispering Pines Valley, Max was restless again, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an urgent energy that Jake recognized from their shared past. The dog refused his food, pacing by the door and looking pointedly toward the creek where they had discovered the injured doe. His behavior spoke of secrets yet uncovered, of dangers still lurking in the pristine wilderness Jake had thought was his refuge. Understanding that Max's instincts had never failed them, Jake equipped himself with basic survival gear and followed his canine partner back upstream, past the spot where they had found hope, as he had begun calling the deer in his mind. The dog moved with singular focus, his nose to the ground, ignoring the familiar scents of the forest that would normally capture his attention. He led Jake to a place where the creek narrowed, its banks churned into a muddy mess by the heavy tire tracks of industrial vehicles that had no business being in this protected wilderness. The earth was scarred, torn up by machinery, and the water itself had an unnatural sheen that caught the morning light in oily rainbows. Tucked away under a thicket of overgrown rhododendron, half buried in contaminated mud, was an object that definitely did not belong in this pristine environment. It was a waterproof field ledger, the kind used on construction sites and in geological surveys, its rugged dark green cover smeared with toxic sludge but remarkably intact. Someone had been careless, leaving behind evidence of their crimes in their haste to cover their tracks. Jake's pulse quickened as he realized what he was holding. This wasn't just circumstantial evidence. This was a smoking gun, a piece of the enemy's operational security dropped carelessly into his world. Max sat patiently beside him, his tail giving a single, satisfied thump against the ground, as if to say his part of the mission was complete. Now it was Jake's turn to piece together the puzzle and decide how to use this unexpected advantage. Back in the warm confines of his rustic cabin, with Hope resting quietly in the converted shed that had become her makeshift hospital, Jake carefully cleaned the mud from the ledger and began examining its contents. The pages were filled with coded notations, chemical formulas, dates, and location markers that would mean nothing to a casual observer, but spoke volumes to someone with Jake's background in military intelligence and environmental hazards. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The entries detailed a systematic and deliberate program of illegal dumping, with toxic industrial byproducts being disposed of in the pristine waterways of the valley. The timing was calculated to coincide with heavy rains that would wash the evidence downstream, dispersing the contamination and making it nearly impossible to trace back to its source. The location codes matched exactly with the area where they had found Hope, confirming that her injury was no accident, but the direct result of criminal negligence. But as Jake flipped deeper into the ledger, studying the technical specifications and construction notes, a more sinister plot began to emerge. Tucked between the dumping schedules were detailed notes on building materials, with specific references to substituting substandard concrete mixtures and using cheaper, non-compliant steel supports in major structural elements. Cross-referencing these notes with the project codes, Jake realized with horror that these compromised materials were destined for Vance's new luxury resort. It wasn't just environmental terrorism. Vance was literally building a death trap that would collapse under the weight of its first major occupancy, potentially killing hundreds of innocent guests. The scope of the corruption was staggering, reaching from environmental destruction to mass murder disguised as cost-cutting measures. On the final page, Jake found what appeared to be a hand-drawn map showing a route to a location designated as Alpha Base. His heart stopped as he recognized the coordinates. It was the old, abandoned ranger station high on the mountain, a forgotten relic from an earlier era of forest management. According to the notations in the ledger, Vance was using this isolated facility as his command center, storing original blueprints, financial records, and digital evidence of his entire criminal enterprise. The abandoned station also housed emergency communication equipment that could reach state and federal authorities, bypassing the local channels that Vance had clearly compromised. Jake now held the roadmap to bringing down his old enemy, but getting there would require crossing hostile territory in the middle of a deadly winter storm. Jake's first priority was ensuring Hope's recovery, both as a matter of basic humanity and as a living symbol of what he was fighting to protect. He named the injured doe Hope, a small act of defiance against the encroaching darkness that Vance represented. Using supplies from his own military medical kit, Jake cleaned her chemical burn with sterile solution and applied antibiotic ointment, his large calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness, learned through years of treating wounded comrades. Max stood guard at the shed door, a silent, furry sentinel who seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. The German shepherd's protective instincts extended naturally to the vulnerable deer, and he would lie by her side during her weakest moments, his warm body providing comfort and his steady breathing a reassuring presence. A few days into Hope's recovery, Jake was surprised by the appearance of a small figure at the edge of his clearing. It was Lily, the 8-year-old niece of Sarah, the local forest ranger. Word had spread through the tight-knit mountain community about the reclusive veteran who had taken in a wounded deer, and Lily's natural love for animals had overcome any fear of the man adults whispered about in hushed tones. Instead of the intimidating, dangerous figure from the rumors, she found a quiet man carefully feeding a deer from his hand, speaking to her in gentle tones that betrayed a wounded soul beneath the hardened exterior. An immediate, unspoken understanding passed between them. Lily began visiting every day after school, sometimes carrying a small bundle of fresh clover she had gathered or a crisp apple from her aunt's trees. She would sit quietly on an old log, watching Jake work with the patience and acceptance that only children possess. She didn't ask probing questions about his past or the obvious sadness that sometimes clouded his eyes. She simply accepted him for who he was in that moment, the man who had saved hope when no one else would have bothered. In her innocent acceptance, Jake felt the first stirrings of the peace he had been desperately seeking since his discharge from the military. He was no longer just a broken soldier hiding from his demons. He was Hope's protector, Lily's friend, and a quiet guardian of something pure and good in an increasingly corrupt world. It was a fragile connection built on trust and shared compassion, but it gave him something precious to fight for, beyond his own survival and vengeance. The fragile peace Jake had begun to build was systematically demolished by Vance's opening salvo in their renewed conflict. Unable to risk a direct confrontation, while Jake possessed the incriminating ledger, Vance chose to wage psychological warfare, weaponizing the small mountain community against the man who threatened his empire. The attack began subtly, with carefully planted rumors that spread through the local diner, post office, and general store like a virus. Old, baseless stories about Jake's military discharge were suddenly revived and twisted into new, more malicious shapes, painting him as an unstable, paranoid recluse whose combat experience had left him dangerous and unpredictable. Vance, playing the role of the concerned businessman and citizen, gave a carefully orchestrated interview to the regional newspaper, expressing his deep sympathy for the veteran's obvious struggles, while subtly implying that Jake's environmental allegations were nothing more than the paranoid delusions of a troubled mind suffering from untreated combat stress. The interview was a masterpiece of manipulation, appearing compassionate on the surface, while systematically undermining Jake's credibility and mental stability. The tactical effectiveness of this character assassination was devastating and immediate. The friendly waves from passing cars stopped abruptly, replaced by suspicious stares and hurried conversations that died when Jake approached. The elderly clerk at the general store, who had always greeted him warmly, became curt and suspicious, handling his purchases as if he might explode at any moment. Parents who had once smiled and nodded when he encountered them on forest trails now gathered their children closer and avoided eye contact. Jake felt the protective walls of his chosen solitude, once a comforting barrier against a hostile world, transform into the suffocating bars of a social prison. He was being methodically isolated, branded as a threat, and dismissed as unreliable, all while the real criminal operated with impunity from behind a facade of respectability and community concern. Every cold stare, every hushed conversation that died when he approached, every act of subtle ostracism was a fresh wound, reopening the old trauma of institutional betrayal that had driven him to seek refuge in these mountains. Vance was using the same tactics that had destroyed Jake's military career, turning his own community against him through whispered lies and manufactured doubt. Recognizing that a war of words and public opinion was one he could never win against an opponent with Vance's resources and connections, Jake shifted his focus from defense to offense, drawing upon the tactical thinking that had kept him alive in far more dangerous situations. Vance controlled the narrative through money and influence, while Jake was an outsider, a ghost haunting the margins of a community that had never fully accepted him. But he possessed something Vance desperately wanted: the ledger and the knowledge it contained. More importantly, Jake understood that his enemy's greatest weakness was arrogance, the same fatal flaw that had led to his downfall in the military. The evidence was his only weapon, but it was worthless unless he could get it to authorities who were beyond Vance's reach and influence. His military training kicked in, pushing aside the hurt and anger of social rejection, replacing emotional pain with cold, analytical strategy. He had a clear objective: penetrate the abandoned ranger station, secure the primary evidence that Vance had stored there, and broadcast it directly to state and federal agencies using the emergency radio equipment. The mission parameters were daunting. According to weather reports, a massive winter storm was approaching the valley, bringing with it blizzard conditions that would make travel nearly impossible, but would also provide perfect cover for his infiltration. The abandoned station was located in hostile territory, accessible only through treacherous mountain terrain that would be crawling with Vance's security personnel. It was, in military terms, a solo deep penetration mission behind enemy lines, with minimal equipment and no backup support. But for Jake, it was familiar ground, the kind of impossible mission that had defined his military service. The approaching storm wasn't just an environmental hazard, it was a tactical opportunity, nature's own smokescreen that would allow him to move unseen and strike at the heart of his enemy's operation. He began making preparations with the methodical precision of a professional soldier, checking equipment, planning routes, and preparing for what might be his final operation. Despite his growing certainty that conventional channels had been compromised, Jake made one final attempt to resolve the situation through proper legal channels, driven partly by his ingrained respect for the rule of law and partly by the hope that he might avoid the dangerous path he was contemplating. He arranged a clandestine meeting with Sarah, the local forest ranger, at a remote trailhead where they could speak without being observed by Vance's network of informants. Presenting her with carefully selected portions of the evidence from the ledger, Jake revealed enough to prove the systematic chemical dumping while withholding details about the construction fraud and his personal history with Vance. He showed her the chemical formulas, the dumping schedules, and the photographs he had taken of the contaminated stream, along with medical documentation of Hope's injuries. Sarah listened with the intense focus of a professional who understood the ecological implications of what Jake was describing. He could see in her eyes that she believed him, or at least wanted to believe him. But he could also see the conflict between her personal convictions and her professional limitations. As an experienced ranger, she recognized the environmental catastrophe that was unfolding. But as a government employee bound by strict protocols, she was trapped by bureaucratic constraints that prevented immediate action. She explained, with obvious frustration, that challenging a developer with Vance's political connections and financial resources required more than a handwritten ledger and photographic evidence. The legal system demanded formal investigations, warrants signed by judges, and a mountain of procedural safeguards that could take months or years to navigate. She simply didn't have the authority to conduct raids on private property based solely on the testimony of a man the entire community now viewed as mentally unstable. Her hands were tied by the very system that was supposed to protect the environment she had dedicated her life to preserving. As she spoke, Jake felt the last door to a peaceful resolution, quietly but firmly click shut. Sarah's regret was genuine and painful to witness, but it was ultimately meaningless in the face of Vance's growing power and influence. The system had failed, just as it had failed him years before, and he was truly on his own now. Her institutional caution, while professionally understandable, had become another obstacle between justice and the innocent lives that hung in the balance. Sensing Jake's growing isolation and desperation, Vance decided to escalate his assault with a precision strike designed to eliminate his enemies to fight back through any remaining legal channels. 3 days after Jake's futile meeting with Sarah, A sheriff's deputy drove slowly up the long gravel driveway to his cabin, the official vehicle's presence adding an ominous weight to the mountain air. The deputy wasn't there to investigate environmental crimes or to provide Jake with protection from threats. Instead, he carried a thick manila envelope containing legal documents that represented Vance's most devastating attack yet. The civil lawsuit filed against Jake was a masterpiece of legal aggression, crafted by expensive attorneys who specialized in destroying inconvenient opponents through financial warfare. The official papers accused Jake of criminal harassment, repeated trespassing on Vance's development properties, and defamation of character for making what the lawsuit termed wild, unsubstantiated, and maliciously false claims that were allegedly damaging Vance's business reputation and causing significant financial losses to his development projects. The monetary damages demanded were astronomical, calculated not to seek actual compensation, but to ensure Jake's complete financial destruction. Vance knew exactly how much money Jake had, which was virtually nothing beyond his modest military disability payments and the minimal savings from his hermit's existence. The lawsuit wasn't designed to be won in court. It was designed to bury Jake under an avalanche of legal fees and court costs that would bankrupt him long before any trial could determine the truth. It was a classic strategy employed by the wealthy and powerful, using the legal system itself as a weapon to silence opposition through economic terrorism. As Jake stood in his doorway, the crisp legal papers feeling heavier in his hands than any weapon he had ever carried into combat, he understood that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. There would be no more appeals to reason, no more attempts to work within a system that had been corrupted beyond recognition. Vance had declared total war, using lawyers and judges instead of soldiers and bullets. But the intent was identical: complete annihilation of his enemy. The massive blizzard was forecast to arrive in exactly 48 hours, bringing with it conditions that would make travel nearly impossible for most people. It was no longer just a tactical opportunity. It was his only remaining chance to strike before Vance's legal machinery ground him into dust. The lawsuit papers represented the final push, the ultimate provocation that sent Jake over the edge from defensive survival into offensive action, transforming him from a victim into a hunter, preparing for the most important mission of his life. The Weather Service had issued severe blizzard warnings for the entire Whispering Pines region, predicting whiteout conditions with winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and snowfall accumulations that would make most roads impassable for days. For most residents of the valley, this forecast meant battening down for a dangerous siege of winter weather. For Jake, it represented the perfect operational window he had been waiting for. Standing in his cabin as the first fat snowflakes began to fall against his windows, he methodically prepared for what might be his final mission. His military gear, carefully maintained despite years of civilian life, came out of storage with the reverence of sacred artifacts. The tactical vest, weatherproof jacket, night vision goggles, and survival equipment were inspected with the thoroughness of a man whose life had often depended on such attention to detail. Max watched every movement with the alert intensity of a combat veteran, recognizing the familiar rhythm of pre-mission preparation. The German shepherd's ears were pricked forward, his body language conveying both excitement and concern as he sensed the gravity of what was approaching. Jake's objective was crystal clear and desperately urgent: infiltrate the abandoned ranger station designated as Alpha Base in Vance's ledger, retrieve the core evidence that would expose the full scope of the criminal conspiracy, and use the emergency radio equipment to broadcast his findings directly to state and federal authorities who were beyond Vance's corrupting influence. The mission timeline was unforgiving. He had to reach the station, complete his objectives, and establish communication before the storm reached its peak intensity and made extraction impossible. As he loaded his pack with survival supplies, medical equipment, and the precious ledger that contained Vance's secrets, Jake felt the familiar transformation that came with accepting a dangerous mission. The hurt, confused civilian who had been victimized by legal warfare was disappearing, replaced by the focused, deadly efficient soldier who had survived countless operations behind enemy lines. The journey to the abandoned ranger station would normally take 3 hours of hiking through well-marked forest trails, but the deteriorating weather conditions and the need for tactical stealth transformed it into a grueling test of endurance and survival skills. Jake and Max left the cabin under cover of the gray pre-dawn darkness, when the snowfall was still manageable, but the wind was already beginning to howl through the mountain passes with ominous intensity. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and each breath created clouds of vapor that dissipated instantly in the brutal air. Jake had chosen a circuitous route that avoided the main trails and known observation points, leading them through dense stands of pine and fir, where the canopy provided some protection from the falling snow, but also created a maze of obstacles and potential ambush sites. Max moved like a ghost beside him, the dog's superior senses constantly scanning for threats, while his thick coat and natural endurance made him far better adapted to these conditions than his human companion. The snow began as individual flakes, but quickly intensified into a steady fall that reduced visibility and made every step treacherous. Jake's military boots, designed for desert combat, were barely adequate for the increasingly slippery terrain, and he found himself relying heavily on his walking stick to maintain balance on slopes that were becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. The forest around them was eerily quiet except for the wind, as if every living creature had sought shelter from the approaching storm. By the time they had covered half the distance to their objective, the snowfall had intensified to near blizzard conditions, and Jake was beginning to understand just how dangerous this mission had become. The cold was seeping through his layers of protective clothing, and the physical exertion required to move through the deepening snow was draining his energy reserves faster than he had anticipated. But there was no turning back now. Vance's legal assault would destroy him if he didn't succeed, and the environmental catastrophe would continue to spread its poison through the valley he had come to love. 3 hours into their trek, as they approached the final ridge before the ranger station, Max suddenly froze in place, his body going rigid with alertness. The dog's behavior was unmistakable to Jake, who had learned to read every nuance of his partner's warnings over years of shared experience. Max had detected human scent carried on the wind, and his positioning indicated the threat was ahead of them, between their current location and their objective. Jake immediately dropped into a crouch, scanning the white landscape ahead through his binoculars. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the dark shapes of at least 2 figures positioned along the main approach to the ranger station. Vance had anticipated his move and deployed security personnel to intercept him. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow, not because he was surprised by the tactical thinking, but because it confirmed that his old enemy knew him well enough to predict his actions. These weren't just random guards. They were specifically positioned to catch someone approaching from Jake's most likely route. The men were equipped with cold weather gear and what appeared to be military-grade weapons, suggesting that Vance had hired professional security contractors rather than relying on local thugs. This changed everything about the mission parameters. What had been planned as a stealth infiltration had just become a combat operation, and Jake found himself outnumbered and outgunned in hostile territory. But his military training and years of experience in asymmetric warfare provided him with options that his enemies might not anticipate. The storm that was making travel so difficult for everyone was also providing perfect concealment for tactical movement. Instead of retreating, Jake decided to use the guards' presence against them, turning their ambush into an opportunity to eliminate threats before they could report his approach to their command structure. Drawing upon every lesson learned in hostile territories around the world, Jake implemented a flanking maneuver that utilized the natural terrain and deteriorating weather conditions to his advantage. Rather than attempting to force his way past the guards through direct confrontation, he led Max on a wide detour that took them around the ridge through a series of rocky outcroppings and dense thickets that provided concealment, but added another hour to their journey time. The detour was physically punishing, requiring them to navigate steep, snow-covered slopes where a single misstep could result in a potentially fatal fall. The blizzard was now reaching its full fury, with winds that made standing upright a constant struggle and snow falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to mere yards. These conditions, while making their approach incredibly dangerous, also provided perfect cover for the final phase of their infiltration. As they crested the ridge above the ranger station, Jake could see the building through the storm, a dark silhouette against the white landscape that looked exactly as he remembered it from his earlier reconnaissance of the area. The structure appeared to be in better condition than he had expected, with recent modifications that suggested Vance had been using it for some time. Lights were visible in several windows, confirming that the facility was currently occupied and operational. But as they began their descent toward the building, Max suddenly alerted again, this time indicating movement directly ahead of them. Through his night vision scope, Jake spotted another pair of guards positioned near what appeared to be a secondary entrance to the station. The security net was more comprehensive than he had initially realized, suggesting that Vance was taking no chances with protecting his command center. Jake made a tactical decision that would have significant consequences for everything that followed. Rather than attempting to neutralize the guards silently, which would be extremely difficult under current conditions and might alert other security personnel, he chose to rely on speed and surprise, making a direct assault on the building while using the storm as cover. The final approach to the ranger station became a nightmare of endurance and tactical precision as Jake and Max navigated the last few hundred yards through conditions that had deteriorated into a full Arctic blizzard. The wind was now howling with such intensity that it threatened to knock them off their feet, while the snow was falling so heavily that it formed an impenetrable white wall that reduced visibility to almost zero. Jake's military training kicked into overdrive as he used hand signals to communicate with Max, relying on their years of partnership to coordinate their movements without verbal communication that might be detected by the guards. The building loomed ahead of them like a fortress, its solid construction and strategic position making it an ideal defensive position for anyone inside. As they drew closer, Jake could see that the modifications to the original ranger station were extensive and professional, with reinforced doors, security cameras, and what appeared to be communication equipment that confirmed this was indeed Vance's operational headquarters. The irony wasn't lost on him that his enemy had chosen a government building, originally constructed to protect the forest, as the base for operations that were systematically destroying it. But as they reached the perimeter of the compound, disaster struck with sudden, overwhelming force. A hidden motion sensor, buried beneath the snow and invisible in the blizzard conditions, triggered a silent alarm that Jake never detected. The first indication that they had been discovered came when powerful spotlights suddenly blazed to life, cutting through the storm and illuminating them like actors on a deadly stage. The lights were followed immediately by the sharp crack of rifle fire, bullets whining past their heads and kicking up explosions of snow around their feet. Jake's combat instincts took over completely as he dove for cover behind a fallen log, pulling Max down beside him as more shots rang out from multiple directions. They were surrounded, caught in a killing field with nowhere to run and minimal cover. The guards had been waiting for them, using the building's defensive advantages and superior numbers to create an inescapable trap. As bullets continued to snap overhead and voices shouted orders through the howling wind, Jake realized that his carefully planned infiltration mission had just become a desperate fight for survival in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The ranger station, which had appeared as their salvation through the storm, revealed itself to be an elaborate trap as Jake and Max found themselves pinned down by crossfire from multiple positions around the compound. The security team had clearly been expecting them, with prepared fighting positions and interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach to the building into a deadly gauntlet. Jake pressed himself against the inadequate cover of the fallen log, feeling the impacts of bullets striking the wood and sending splinters flying past his head. Max, responding to years of training and battlefield experience, had found his own cover and was lying flat against the ground, his intelligent eyes watching Jake for signals, while his ears tracked the movement of their attackers through the audio chaos of the storm. The tactical situation was desperate. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the open with no viable escape route back down the mountain through the blizzard. But Jake's military experience had taught him that seemingly impossible situations often contained hidden opportunities for those calm enough to recognize them. The same storm that had betrayed their approach was also working against their enemies, limiting visibility and making accurate shooting extremely difficult. The guards were forced to fire at muzzle flashes and movement rather than clearly identified targets, which meant their superior numbers were partially negated by the conditions. More importantly, their defensive positions were designed to stop someone trying to break into the building, not someone willing to use unconventional tactics and accept extreme risks. As another volley of shots rang out, Jake made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching, but was actually based on cold, tactical logic. Instead of trying to retreat or find better cover, he was going to assault the building directly, using the storm and the enemy's own defensive preparations against them. The plan was simple, desperate, and completely dependent on Max's extraordinary abilities and their perfect coordination under fire. They were going to turn this trap into their own killing ground, but first they had to survive long enough to reach the building that held all the answers to Vance's criminal empire and the evidence that could save the valley from environmental disaster. The blizzard had reached its terrifying peak, transforming the abandoned ranger station into an Arctic fortress surrounded by a howling white hell that seemed determined to claim every living thing in its path. Jake and Max were trapped in a deadly siege, pinned down by Vance's security team, while the storm raged around them with such ferocity that survival itself became a minute-by-minute struggle against the forces of nature. The temperature had plummeted to life-threatening levels, and the wind was driving snow with such violence that it felt like being sandblasted with ice. Jake could feel the cold seeping through his layers of protective clothing, numbing his fingers and making it increasingly difficult to maintain his grip on his weapon. Each breath burned his lungs with Arctic air, and his body was beginning to show the early signs of hypothermia despite his constant movement and adrenaline. Max, better adapted to the extreme conditions, was still suffering from the brutal cold, his thick coat providing some protection, but not enough to shield him indefinitely from nature's assault. The German shepherd's breathing created clouds of vapor that were instantly torn away by the screaming wind, and Jake could see ice forming around the dog's muzzle despite his efforts to find shelter. The tactical situation had devolved from a planned infiltration into a desperate fight for survival against both human enemies and the most hostile environment either of them had ever encountered. The spotlights that had exposed their position were now creating an eerie, otherworldly scene as the light diffused through the swirling snow, creating shifting patterns of visibility that made it almost impossible to distinguish between shadows, snowdrifts, and potential threats. Jake realized with growing alarm that if they remained pinned down in these conditions for much longer, the cold would kill them more efficiently than any bullets fired by Vance's hired guns. The mission had become a race against time on multiple fronts. They had to neutralize the security threat, reach the evidence inside the station, and establish communication with the outside world before the storm claimed their lives or made rescue impossible for days to come. Back at the valley floor, in Jake's warm cabin where hope had made her recovery, an atmosphere of growing dread settled over the small sanctuary as the full fury of the blizzard descended upon Whispering Pines. The injured doe, now strong enough to move freely within the converted shed that had become her temporary home, began displaying behavior that seemed to transcend normal animal instincts. She paced restlessly, moving from window to window with an agitation that spoke of deep, inexplicable anxiety. Her large, dark eyes held an almost human expression of worry as she gazed out into the white chaos, as if she could sense that her rescuer was in mortal danger somewhere in that howling wilderness. The connection between Hope and Jake had grown profound during her recovery, a bond forged through trust, care, and mutual survival that seemed to create an empathic link extending far beyond the normal relationship between human and wild animal. Meanwhile, Sarah, the forest ranger who had become reluctantly involved in Jake's fight against Vance's environmental crimes, was experiencing her own mounting concern at the ranger station headquarters several miles away. The complete breakdown of all communication systems due to the storm had left her feeling helpless and increasingly convinced that Jake had attempted something desperate and dangerous. She had tried repeatedly to reach him by radio, telephone, and even emergency channels, but the blizzard had effectively isolated the entire valley from the outside world. Her professional experience with mountain weather told her that anyone caught in the open during conditions this severe faced almost certain death, and her growing personal attachment to Jake made that possibility unbearable. As the hours passed without any word from him, Sarah made a decision that went against every protocol in the Ranger Service manual, but aligned perfectly with her conscience and heart. Gathering her emergency gear, winter survival equipment, and enlisting the help of her niece Lily despite the danger, she prepared to venture out into the storm to search for Jake and Max. It was a desperate measure that could easily result in more casualties, but Sarah couldn't stand by knowing that a good man might be dying alone in the wilderness, while she remained safe and warm. The storm had transformed from a natural phenomenon into a test of character, forcing everyone connected to Jake's mission to choose between safety and loyalty, between following rules and following their hearts. In the chaos surrounding the ranger station, Max demonstrated why German Shepherds had been chosen as military working dogs for over a century, displaying intelligence, courage, and tactical awareness that elevated him from pet to genuine combat partner. While Jake maintained suppressing fire against the security team's positions, Max began executing a flanking maneuver that utilized his natural advantages of stealth, speed, and four-legged mobility in ways that no human combatant could match. The dog moved like a phantom through the swirling snow, his dark coat making him nearly invisible against the storm-darkened landscape as he circled around the building to approach the guards from their blind spots. Max's superior hearing allowed him to track the enemy's movements despite the howling wind, while his sense of smell gave him precise information about their numbers, positions, and even their emotional states. The German Shepherd's tactical intelligence became evident as he systematically began disrupting the security team's carefully planned defensive positions, not through direct attacks, but through psychological warfare that exploited their natural fears and limitations. He would appear suddenly at the edge of their vision, a menacing shadow in the storm, then vanish before they could bring their weapons to bear. The sound of his movement through the snow and his occasional, strategically timed growls created an atmosphere of paranoia and uncertainty among Vance's hired guns. This guerrilla campaign divided their attention between the known threat of Jake's position and the unknown danger represented by Max's prowling presence in the darkness. The dog's actions weren't random or instinctual. They were the calculated moves of an intelligent combatant who understood that fear could be as effective a weapon as bullets in the right circumstances. By the time the security team realized they were facing not just one desperate man, but a coordinated two-member team with complementary skills and perfect cooperation, their tactical advantage had been significantly eroded, and their confidence in their defensive positions was beginning to crack under the pressure of fighting an unconventional enemy in impossible conditions. While Max conducted his psychological assault on the perimeter guards, Jake was engaged in his own desperate struggle to reach the emergency radio equipment that represented his only hope of summoning help and exposing Vance's crimes to the outside world. The ranger station's interior was a maze of converted rooms, jury-rigged equipment, and stacks of documents that confirmed this had indeed been Vance's operational headquarters for months. Jake moved through the building with the methodical precision of a soldier clearing hostile territory, checking each room for threats while searching for the communication center that had to be somewhere in the complex. The sound of gunfire and shouting from outside told him that Max was keeping the security team occupied, but he knew their time was running out as the storm continued to intensify and the cold began to take its toll on both of them. Following power cables and communication lines, Jake finally located what had once been the station's radio room, now converted into a sophisticated command center with computer terminals, digital communication equipment, and maps showing the full scope of Vance's environmental crimes throughout the valley. But the crown jewel of the room was an old but well-maintained emergency radio system, a powerful long-range transmitter designed to reach state and federal emergency services, even when all other communication systems failed. Jake's hands, nearly numb from cold despite his gloves, worked frantically to power up the system and establish contact with the outside world. The radio crackled to life with static and distant voices, confirming that it still functioned despite the storm's interference with most electronic systems. But as he prepared to begin transmitting the evidence that would destroy Vance's criminal empire, Jake heard the distinctive crack of splintering wood and the sound of heavy boots on the floor below. The security team had breached the building's defenses and was now hunting him through the converted ranger station. The race had entered its final, most dangerous phase, with Jake trapped inside a building that was rapidly becoming his tomb, while Max fought desperately outside to buy him the precious minutes needed to complete their mission and call for rescue. The emergency radio equipment responded to Jake's desperate efforts with agonizing slowness, the old tubes and circuits taking precious seconds to warm up and establish connection protocols, while the sound of pursuing footsteps grew closer with each passing moment. His hands, nearly useless from cold and stress, fumbled with the controls as he tried to remember the proper frequencies for state and federal emergency services, military channels that might still be monitored, and any other communication link that could carry his message beyond Vance's sphere of influence. The radio finally crackled to life with a weak but audible signal, and Jake began transmitting a compressed message that included his identity, location, the nature of Vance's environmental and construction crimes, and a desperate plea for immediate assistance. But the transmission was interrupted by interference from the storm, creating bursts of static that might have rendered parts of his message incomprehensible to anyone trying to receive it. Jake repeated the message multiple times, varying frequencies and power levels in an attempt to punch through the atmospheric interference, knowing that each second he spent at the radio reduced his chances of survival as armed men searched the building for him. The sound of doors being kicked open and rooms being cleared told him that Vance's security team was conducting a systematic search that would inevitably lead them to his position. But just as Jake was beginning to lose hope that his message had reached anyone, a faint response crackled through the static. A professional voice acknowledging receipt of an emergency transmission and requesting confirmation of details. The voice was barely audible through the interference, but it represented contact with the outside world, proof that someone beyond the valley had received at least part of his desperate communication. Jake quickly confirmed his identity, location, and the urgent nature of the situation before the radio was suddenly destroyed by a burst of automatic weapons fire that filled the communication room with sparks and smoke. He spun around to find himself facing two armed men in tactical gear, their weapons trained on him with professional precision. But even as they ordered him to surrender, Jake felt a surge of grim satisfaction, knowing that his message had been transmitted, that somewhere beyond the storm, authorities were being alerted to the crimes being committed in Whispering Pines Valley. In the midst of the chaos and gunfire surrounding the ranger station, Max performed the most heroic action of his remarkable life, demonstrating the fearless loyalty that had made German Shepherds legendary among military working dogs throughout history. One of Vance's security contractors had managed to reach a firing position with a clear line of sight to Jake through a window, and was taking careful aim with a high-powered rifle when Max spotted the threat from his position in the storm. Without hesitation, The German Shepherd launched himself through the swirling snow in a desperate charge that covered 30 yards of open ground in seconds, his powerful muscles propelling him forward despite the exhaustion of hours spent fighting in sub-zero conditions. The guard, focused on his target and confident in his concealed position, never saw the dark shape hurtling toward him through the blizzard until it was far too late to react. Max struck the gunman with the full force of his body weight and momentum, knocking the rifle aside just as the trigger was pulled and sending the potentially fatal shot wide of its intended target. The impact sent both the dog and the human tumbling into the snow. But Max recovered first, his training and natural aggressiveness driving him to press his attack with savage intensity. The guard's tactical gear provided some protection, but no amount of equipment could prepare him for the fury of a combat-trained German Shepherd defending his partner's life. Max's powerful jaws clamped down on the man's gun arm, his teeth finding purchase through fabric and flesh with bone-crushing force that made continued resistance impossible. The rifle fell forgotten into the snow as the guard screamed in pain and terror, overwhelmed by an opponent whose courage and determination exceeded anything in his experience. But Max's heroic intervention came at a cost. Other members of the security team had observed the attack and were converging on his position with weapons drawn, preparing to eliminate the four-legged threat that had disrupted their carefully planned operation. The sound of Max's fierce battle outside the ranger station reached Jake just as his own situation inside the building was reaching a critical point, and the knowledge that his loyal partner was fighting for both their lives gave him the strength and determination to continue his own desperate struggle. The destruction of the radio equipment had been a serious setback, but Jake's military training had taught him that battles were won by adapting to changing circumstances rather than mourning lost opportunities. The two armed guards who had cornered him in the communication room were professional soldiers, but they had made the tactical error of assuming that a single man trapped in an enclosed space represented a manageable threat. Jake's years of combat experience in urban environments had taught him how to use confined spaces to his advantage, turning the apparent disadvantage of being trapped into an opportunity for close-quarters combat, where superior numbers mattered less than training and desperation. Using the smoke and confusion created by the destroyed radio equipment as cover, Jake launched himself at the nearest guard with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The close-quarters battle that followed was brutal and decisive, with Jake's superior training and intimate knowledge of hand-to-hand combat techniques overwhelming opponents who had relied too heavily on their weapons and tactical advantages. But even as he gained the upper hand in his immediate fight, Jake could hear the sounds of Max's battle outside growing more intense and desperate, and he knew that his partner's heroic actions were buying him time at a terrible cost. The German Shepherd's courage and sacrifice had created a window of opportunity that Jake was determined not to waste, and he began fighting his way toward the exit with renewed purpose and deadly efficiency. The arrival of Sarah and her rescue team represented a dramatic shift in the tactical situation surrounding the ranger station, transforming Jake and Max's desperate last stand into a coordinated rescue operation with professional support and superior numbers. Sarah had violated every safety protocol in the Ranger Service manual by venturing out into the blizzard, but her intimate knowledge of mountain terrain and weather patterns had allowed her to navigate conditions that would have been impossible for less experienced personnel. She had brought with her a small team of volunteers from the valley, men and women who had grown to respect Jake, despite the rumors spread by Vance, and who understood that a good man's life was worth risking their own safety to preserve. The team's arrival was announced by the distinctive sound of snowmobile engines cutting through the howling wind, followed by the organized shouts of people deploying into tactical positions around the besieged building. Sarah's voice, amplified by a battery-powered megaphone, cut through the chaos of gunfire and storm as she identified herself as law enforcement and ordered Vance's security team to lay down their weapons and surrender immediately. The psychological impact of outside intervention was devastating to the hired guns, who had counted on isolation and weather conditions to prevent any interference with their operation. Suddenly faced with the prospect of being charged with assaulting law enforcement officers in addition to their existing crimes, several members of the security team began to reconsider their loyalty to an employer who had placed them in an impossible situation. The tactical balance that had favored Vance's forces due to superior numbers and defensive positions was suddenly reversed, with Jake and Max's guerrilla resistance becoming part of a larger coordinated assault on the ranger station. Sarah's team moved with the precision of experienced mountain rescue personnel, using their knowledge of the terrain and weather conditions to outmaneuver opponents who were struggling to maintain their footing and visibility in the deteriorating storm. The sound of organized resistance and professional tactical communications created panic among Vance's remaining loyal guards, who began to realize that their carefully planned operation was collapsing around them, and that their chances of escape were diminishing with each passing minute. The final confrontation between Jake and Elias Vance took place in the converted ranger station's main room, surrounded by the evidence of environmental crimes and construction fraud that had brought them to this desperate moment in the heart of a deadly blizzard. Vance emerged from his hiding place among the stacked documents and computer terminals, no longer the polished businessman who had manipulated public opinion and legal systems, but a desperate criminal cornered by the consequences of his own actions. The years had not been kind to Jake's former adversary. Vance's face showed the strain of maintaining his criminal enterprise, and his eyes held the desperate gleam of a man who understood that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The two former soldiers faced each other across a room filled with the proof of Vance's betrayal of every principle they had once sworn to uphold. Their personal animosity now crystallized into a confrontation that would determine not only their individual fates, but the future of the valley and its innocent inhabitants. Vance still carried himself with the arrogance that had defined his character throughout their military service together, but Jake could see the fear beneath the bravado, the knowledge that his crimes had finally caught up with him in a way that money and influence couldn't fix. The sound of gunfire and shouting from outside told both men that the larger battle was still raging, but in this moment, they were alone with their shared history and mutual hatred. Two ghosts from a military past that had shaped them both in fundamentally different ways. Jake's hand rested on his weapon, but he made no move to draw it. This confrontation demanded something more personal than bullets, a resolution that acknowledged the depth of their mutual betrayal and the cost of the choices they had both made. Vance spoke first, his voice carrying the same manipulative charm that had once fooled superior officers and government officials, attempting to negotiate a solution that would preserve his freedom and fortune even in these desperate circumstances. But Jake had learned to see through such deceptions, and his response was measured, deadly, and final in its implications for both their futures. The tactical situation around the ranger station resolved itself with sudden, overwhelming finality as the combined pressure of Sarah's rescue team and the deteriorating weather conditions broke the remaining resistance from Vance's security forces. The hired guns, faced with professional law enforcement personnel, backed by federal authority, and increasingly desperate conditions that threatened their own survival, began surrendering in groups, rather than continuing a fight that had become hopeless. Sarah's voice over the megaphone offered safe passage and medical attention to anyone who laid down their weapons immediately, while promising federal prosecution for anyone who continued to resist lawful authorities. The psychological warfare was as effective as any physical assault. These were professional soldiers who understood when a tactical situation had become untenable, and their loyalty to Vance extended only as far as their paychecks and personal survival. Within minutes, the sound of gunfire had been replaced by the voices of prisoners calling out their surrender, and the organized activity of Sarah's team securing the area and providing medical assistance to wounded personnel from both sides. The storm continued to rage around them with undiminished fury, but the human conflict had ended with Jake and Max's mission accomplished and their enemies defeated. Inside the ranger station, Jake had succeeded in overpowering Vance despite his enemy's desperate final attempts at negotiation and threats, using physical restraints to secure the man who had caused so much destruction and pain. The evidence surrounding them in the converted command center represented years of environmental crimes and construction fraud that would result in multiple federal indictments and the complete destruction of Vance's business empire. But more importantly for Jake, it represented vindication for his years of exile and proof that his decision to fight back against corruption and betrayal had been justified by the results. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was dominated by the urgent need to evacuate all personnel from the ranger station before the blizzard made rescue impossible and claimed additional lives through exposure and hypothermia. Sarah's rescue team worked with military efficiency to assess injuries, secure evidence, and prepare for the dangerous journey back to safety through conditions that continued to deteriorate with each passing hour. Jake, exhausted but victorious, was reunited with Max in a moment of profound emotional release that acknowledged the extraordinary courage and loyalty the German Shepherd had displayed throughout their desperate mission. The dog bore wounds from his battles with the security team, but his injuries were not life-threatening, and his joy at being reunited with his human partner was evident despite his exhaustion and pain. Together, they had accomplished something that seemed impossible just hours earlier. They had exposed a massive criminal conspiracy, prevented an environmental disaster that could have poisoned the valley for generations, and stopped a construction fraud that would have killed innocent people when the resort's substandard buildings inevitably collapsed. The evidence secured from Vance's command center would lead to federal investigations that would ultimately restore the health of Whispering Pines Valley and bring justice to those who had tried to destroy it for personal profit. As the rescue team prepared for the treacherous journey back to civilization, Jake looked around the ranger station one last time, seeing it not as the fortress where he had nearly died, but as the place where he had finally confronted the ghosts of his past and emerged victorious. The storm outside continued to howl with undiminished fury, but inside the building there was a sense of completion and justice that had been years in the making. The war between Jake and Vance was finally over, decided not by lawyers and politicians, but by courage, loyalty, and the determination of one man and his dog to protect something beautiful and innocent from those who would destroy it for profit. 3 weeks after the blizzard that had nearly claimed their lives, Whispering Pines Valley was transformed into a scene of restoration and renewal that seemed almost miraculous to those who remembered the dark days of Vance's environmental terrorism. Federal investigators had descended upon the valley with the efficiency of a military operation, using the evidence Jake had secured from the ranger station to build an airtight case that would send Elias Vance and his conspirators to federal prison for decades. The abandoned construction site that had once been destined to become a luxury resort, built on poisoned ground, was now swarming with environmental cleanup crews, their bright yellow hazmat suits a stark contrast to the pristine snow that covered the mountainsides. Specialized teams worked around the clock to remove the toxic waste that had been illegally dumped throughout the valley's watershed, using techniques that would not only eliminate the immediate contamination, but restore the natural ecosystem to its original health. The stream where Jake had first discovered Hope's chemical burns now ran clear and clean, its waters tested daily to ensure that no trace of Vance's pollution remained to threaten the wildlife that depended on it for survival. Jake stood on his cabin's porch each morning, watching the cleanup operations with a satisfaction that went deeper than mere vindication. He had kept his promise to protect this beautiful place and its innocent inhabitants. Hope herself had become the symbol of the valley's recovery, a living testament to the power of compassion and determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable corruption. The young doe had made a complete recovery from her injuries and had been released back into the wild, but she often appeared at the edge of Jake's clearing as if to check on the man who had saved her life, and, in doing so, saved the entire valley. The sight of her healthy, unmarked coat and bright, alert eyes reminded everyone who saw her that individual actions could make a difference, that one person's courage could protect an entire ecosystem from those who would destroy it for profit. Vance's business empire had collapsed completely under the weight of federal indictments, civil lawsuits, and the complete loss of public trust, ensuring that he would never again have the power to threaten innocent communities or pristine environments. Jake's transformation from isolated hermit to respected community member had been as dramatic as the valley's environmental recovery, representing a personal healing that paralleled the restoration of the natural world around him. The man who had once hidden from human contact, afraid of the judgment and betrayal that had driven him into exile, now found himself welcomed into a community that recognized him as a hero and protector. The rumors and suspicions that Vance had carefully cultivated had evaporated overnight when the truth of Jake's mission became known, replaced by gratitude and respect from neighbors who understood that his courage had saved their homes, their health, and their way of life. Sarah, the forest ranger who had risked her own life to rescue him during the blizzard, had become much more than a professional colleague. Their shared experience of fighting against corruption and environmental destruction had forged a bond that was growing deeper with each passing day. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and the knowledge that they had both been willing to sacrifice everything to protect something greater than themselves. Little Lily, Sarah's niece, had become Jake's most devoted supporter and frequent visitor, her innocent acceptance and boundless enthusiasm helping to heal wounds that had festered for years in isolation. The girl's daily visits to check on the animals Jake cared for and her endless questions about forest ecology and wildlife conservation reminded him that his mission had been about more than revenge or justice. It had been about preserving a world of wonder and beauty for future generations. Jake had discovered that his military skills and survival knowledge made him an ideal candidate for environmental protection work, and he had accepted a position with the State Wildlife Service that would allow him to continue protecting the valley while building a new life surrounded by people who valued his contributions. The cabin that had once been a refuge from the world had become a hub of community activity, with neighbors stopping by to share news, ask advice, or simply enjoy the company of a man they had come to see as a guardian of their shared heritage. What did you think of Max's bravery throughout this incredible journey? Share a story about your own loyal companion in the comments below, and let us know how they've impacted your life. One peaceful evening, as the sun set behind the snow-capped peaks that surrounded Whispering Pines Valley, Jake sat on his cabin's front porch with Max lying contentedly at his feet, both of them watching the world they had fought so hard to protect settle into the quiet rhythms of a healthy, thriving ecosystem. The German Shepherd bore small scars from their battle at the ranger station, permanent reminders of the courage he had displayed in defense of his human partner. But his spirit remained unbroken and his loyalty absolute. The bond between them had been forged in combat and tested in the crucible of life and death struggle, creating a partnership that transcended the usual relationship between human and dog. Max was no longer just a pet or even a working animal. He was Jake's brother-in-arms, his most trusted ally, and the living embodiment of the loyalty and courage that had made their victory possible. Their daily walks through the valley revealed a landscape that was healing from years of hidden abuse, with wildlife returning to areas that had been poisoned by Vance's illegal dumping and plants beginning to flourish in soil that had been restored to its natural purity. Jake often found himself stopping to watch deer drinking from the stream that now ran clear and clean, remembering the day when Max had led him to Hope's injured form and set in motion the chain of events that had saved them all. The local community had embraced both man and dog as heroes, with children asking to pet Max and adults nodding respectfully to Jake when they encountered him in town. The transformation was complete. He was no longer an outsider looking in, but an integral part of the community's fabric, valued for his unique skills and respected for his unwavering commitment to protecting what mattered most. As twilight deepened into night and the first stars appeared above the mountain peaks, Jake reflected on how dramatically his life had changed from those dark days when he had believed himself to be a broken man with nothing left to offer the world. His partnership with Max had taught him that loyalty could overcome any obstacle, that courage could triumph over corruption, and that even the most damaged souls could find redemption through service to something greater than themselves. Stories like this deserve to be told, reminding us all of the power of loyalty and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next inspiring tale of courage and companionship. As the seasons changed and the valley continued its remarkable recovery, Jake came to understand that his journey from broken veteran to environmental guardian represented something larger than personal redemption. It was a testament to the fundamental truth that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they found the courage to stand up for what was right. He had come to the forest seeking solitude and escape from the painful memories of betrayal and failure, only to discover that his true calling lay in protecting others from the same kind of corruption that had wounded him so deeply. The military skills that had once been used in foreign conflicts had found new purpose in defending the American wilderness from domestic enemies who cared nothing for the natural heritage they were destroying. Max remained his constant companion and partner in this new mission, their shared experiences having created a communication that required no words and a trust that knew no boundaries. The German Shepherd's intelligence and courage continued to amaze everyone who witnessed their partnership. As if the dog understood that he was not just Jake's pet, but an active participant in a larger mission to protect and preserve. Together, they patrolled the valley's restored wilderness, ensuring that no new threats emerged to endanger the ecosystem they had fought so hard to save, and serving as living symbols of hope for communities facing their own environmental challenges. The story of their battle against Vance had spread far beyond the valley, inspiring other individuals and communities to stand up against pollution and corruption in their own areas. Jake often received letters from people who had heard about his fight and wanted to know how they could protect their own communities from similar threats, and he always responded with practical advice and encouragement, emphasizing that ordinary citizens had more power than they realized when they chose to act with courage and determination. The abandoned ranger station where they had fought their final battle had been converted into an environmental education center, with displays showing how individual action could triumph over institutional corruption and corporate greed. He came to the forest to escape from one war, only to find himself fighting in another. But this time, he wasn't fighting for distant politicians or abstract principles. He was fighting for a home, for innocent lives, and for a future where beauty could exist without fear of those who would destroy it for profit. And beside him stood a companion who had never worn a uniform, but possessed a soldier's heart. A four-legged warrior whose loyalty was absolute and whose courage never wavered. Jake learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in our own backyards, and that the greatest victories are measured not in territory conquered, but in lives protected and wilderness preserved. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage, loyalty, and determination. The next story is appearing on your screen now, featuring another hero whose bond with his faithful companion will inspire and amaze you. Click to continue the journey and discover how ordinary people and their extraordinary animals can change the world through love, courage, and unwavering dedication to what matters most.